Maybe it's worth saying a little bit about where Vertov came from, just to kind of set the scene. Because Vertov was one of those figures who joined the infant Soviet film business, having had no previous experience of film. There had been a flourishing film industry in Russia, as we now know, which we only really found out about during the 1980s. But Vertov was somebody who had no previous contact with film. He originally, when he came to Moscow, he thought of himself as a poet, and then he did some medical studies, and he was kind of swimming around in the late teens, like a lot of young men, trying to work out what was modern, what was possible to get into. He definitely had avant-garde tendencies, and that found expression in his poetry. When the revolution came, he kind of fell into film, which is not very different really from what happened to Eisenstein, for instance, and quite a number of others. It was really a new generation of people who encountered film having never had any ambition to work in cinema when they were growing up. In Vertov's case, though, he started earlier really than almost anybody else. So while people like Eisenstein were still, trying to find their way, and Eisenstein was in theatre at this time, Vertov fell into film at the very, very beginning of the post-revolutionary period and actually found himself in charge of chronicling the very early stages of the Soviet regime, the establishment of the Soviet regime. And undoubtedly, I think that marked him. He felt like a pioneer. Although he wasn't that much older than many of his contemporaries, he always rather acted the "I was here first." And that may have had some bearing on the kind of tensions that developed in the course of the 20s, I think. But it also meant that he cut his teeth on making documentaries, well, what we would call documentaries today, chronicles, filming what was happening, joining it up, and trying to find ways of presenting this kind of living chronicle as quickly as possible so that people could actually see the revolution taking shape around them. And I think that influenced him too. He really was a pioneer in terms of shooting a new kind of newsreel, chronicle, a record of what was widely regarded as the creation of a new world. But it didn't necessarily mean that he was cut out for the directions that Soviet cinema would go in when things began to settle down a bit. And of course, that was to lead to a kind of lasting gulf between Vertov and, well, really the others, almost everybody else. Maybe it was to do with his character. Maybe it was to do with the aesthetic position that he'd taken up. And maybe it was to do with just when he'd started ahead of everybody else. But some combination of these led to him being, I think, really very much out on a limb, although he didn't initially see it that way, of course, but certainly as his career developed and didn't develop, he did come to feel out on a limb. So when we look at kind of the beginnings of Vertov, which have only recently begun to be looked at, really. I mean, when I first encountered Vertov in the 1960s, the only film we knew was The Man with a Movie Camera, the world's most popular silent documentary. And in a way, we were starting at the end. And I think that's been interesting in terms of the way people think about Vertov, the way they form judgments, that almost everybody in the present world has started at the end. Usually they've seen The Man with the Movie Camera first. That's kind of almost unavoidable because it's omnipresent. It's widely shown. When I worked at the BFI, I used to be the distributor of it, and we had, I think, 4 16mm prints which were constantly booked out. So we know that almost everybody who was studying film in those pioneer days saw Man with a Movie Camera under one heading or another. And that undoubtedly actually marked attitudes to Vertov and to his position amongst other Soviet filmmakers. But then, since that time, since the 70s and particularly since the 80s, I think people have been working backwards and asking a lot of questions about, well, okay, where did Vertov come from? What gave him this particular orientation? What else did he make, indeed, is still a live issue. Vertov hit on the idea of branding the films he was making in a sort of high concept way. The first series that he made, really like a newsreel, was called Kino Nedelia, film weekly. And that's very similar in essence to the kind of newsreels that were being made in most countries by this time. But when the Kino Nedelia series came to an end, he decided to take it up a level and conceived the idea of Kino Pravda. Now, Kino Pravda was a very direct, blatant effort to raise the status of film by attaching it to something that was emblematic of the Soviet regime, which was Pravda, Lenin's newspaper. So Vertov thought, well, why shouldn't film have the same status? Why shouldn't this be film truth? And so the second major series that he launched was Kino Pravda. And for that, he moved away from the strict newsreel sense. These are much more varied films. In fact, they're short films. They come in different lengths, different formats. They're much more experimental. They do still report on things that are happening. They pick up on current events, but they often treat them in quite a stylized way. And it's on Kino Pravda that Vertov started to collaborate with other leftist artists, particularly Rodchenko. And some of the Kino Pravda series have got wonderful titles by Rodchenko, which are real pieces of constructivist art. And that, of course, moves Vertov into an interesting area, because instead of film being something that's outside of all the exciting developments in constructivism and cubo-futurism and so forth, he brings film into that arena by making that alliance. Of course, the films are still records of contemporary events, so they have this kind of dual identity. And that's led to problems. People who go to them expecting them to be just like Tatlin, just like Malevich, just like Rodchenko, they're not. They're allied with some of those tendencies in left art, but they're not the same thing at all. They're still trying to earn their keep by recording, contemporary events. And when, come 1923 and especially 1924, Vertov could see that there was really no future in just going on producing these series. I mean, he had to stake a claim for something bigger. And he does this in two ways, really. One is by producing some very special editions as the last editions of Kino Pravda. And they take the form of commemorating the death of Lenin. So in Kino Pravda number 21, he creates a kind of mourning piece which reflects on the year that has passed since Lenin's death. And it's been, in the first wave of enthusiasm for discovering Vertov's earlier work, this was sometimes likened to being a kind of icon. I mean, obviously not a religious icon, very much a secular icon, but really trying to find a way of commemorating Lenin in a sort of very Russian way, which some people felt was icon-like in the way that it treated the image, as if the image of Lenin was something sacred, in a secular way. Perhaps a difficult concept, but there's no question that for Vertov, Lenin was a sacred figure, and in many ways the early death of Lenin became the sort of guiding theme of a lot of Vertov's work, because he goes on mourning Lenin long after others have moved on, as it were, and his last major film, Three Songs of Lenin, is just that. It's a reflection on the 10 years that have passed since Lenin's death. So this is really very important when he kind of stakes his claim. But the other thing that he does around this time in 1924 is to aim at moving away from the weekly episode towards a full-length film. And he produces a film known as Kino Glas, Film I, which is like a feature film, except it's not a feature film. It's a collection of episodes and of material that have been shot for Kino Pravda, which are put together to form a kind of non-fiction survey of things that are happening in the Soviet Union at this time. The anti-religion campaigns, that's a big theme of the time. And so Vertov features the anti-religious campaign. He also features the campaigns against alcohol, again, another characteristic of the time. And he celebrates the work of the young pioneers. The pioneers, the youngsters, are seen as, the future. They're the hope for a truly Soviet future, because they will have grown up in this new world that is being created. And so, apart from being a wonderful subject, as they kind of run around and are animated and active and like Boy Scouts, as it were, apart from that, he sort of, there's a big ideological investment from his point of view too. So if you look at the components that make up Kinoglas, what you see is a kind of manifesto. These are the things that matter. Out with the old, up with the new, on into the future. So it's an interesting film in terms of, taking a claim for being a kind of founding film of a new kind of cinema. And actually, Vertov did rather well with it, because it got sent to the expo in Paris, the Exposition des Arts Décoratifs, as one of the two Soviet entries. The other one was by Eisenstein. It was his first film, Strike. And they both got medals. There's some lack of clarity, I have to say, about exactly whether they ever got shown or whether they just had the medals stuck on them because, they came from the Soviet Union, so they must be good, must be interesting. It is also alleged, and I've not managed to get to the bottom of this, that Eisenstein's got the higher award, which again might have something to do with the considerable rivalry that existed between these two leading figures. But whatever happened, it was Vertov's first mark of distinction abroad, because everything else that he'd done before this, of course, had purely domestic circulation. So nobody knew about it outside. I mean, he might be one of the most hardworking, most widely screened of the new generation of Soviet filmmakers, but he certainly wasn't getting any reputation outside of Russia at this time. But from that moment in Paris, people begin to have heard of him, and his name, I think, starts to circulate among the few people who have a sense that something really exciting is happening back in Soviet Russia. Once Vertov makes a start in long films, in feature-length films, in a way there's no way back. I mean, to go back to making short chronicles would be definitely a step back. And he's got a public position to advance and to defend. So in the mid-20s, after Kinoglas, he develops a very public position as a polemicist, as somebody who's up there publishing manifestos, getting involved in debates, really drawing attention to what he's about. He forms a group, because groups are very fashionable at the time. Everybody's in a group. His are called the Kinoki, or the Council of Three. Basically, it's his wife, Svilova, Elizaveta Svilova, and his brother, Mikhail Kaufman, because Dziga Vertov's real name is Denis Kaufman, but he's adopted this very wonderful nom de cinéma of Dziga Vertov, back in his futurist period, really, which is kind of translates as spinning top, but it gave him an interesting kind of persona. It's not a boring old conventional Russian name. It's a name that nobody can quite categorize. He's not the only one who's doing that. This is a period of self-fashioning, when a lot of people who want to present themselves as something different do take on a new name. They take on a new identity. So he's very much in keeping with the spirit of the times. He publishes a series of manifestos, which really begins in 23 and continues intensively, 23, 24, 25. He's coming out with these wonderful manifestos. I mean, they're very exhilarating. They read very well. They have a fantastic rhetorical sense of, we are going to change everything. Everything that has gone before is rubbish. Forget about that. The future is us. And those manifestos obviously are in keeping with the spirit that everything needs to be made afresh. On the left front of the arts, that was another group, the Left group, which Vertov was associated with. Everybody was trying to make everything different. And so he was like the film wing of that. This is before Eisenstein, who of course would become much more famous, has really got started. And it's interesting just to reflect for a moment that Eisenstein only gets started in cinema actually thanks to Vertov. In a way, he's been interested in film, and he wants to include a short film in one of his theatre productions. Enough simplicity for every wise man. But where can he get some film? From Dziga Vertov. So he goes to Vertov, does a deal, and Vertov supplies the film and probably the cameraman as well, and they shoot a short film, Glumov's Diary, which was believed lost for decades, but it was only found in the Soviet archive, the newsreel archive, because it was tacked onto the end of one of Dziga Vertov's Kino Pravdas. So in a sense, Eisenstein owed Vertov a lot in terms of getting started. His very first film was a kind of appendix to a Kino Pravda. But that position, that public position that Vertov was taking up, of course, had its problems, because he was really condemning everything that many others were working to achieve, which is to create a genuinely popular but Soviet cinema. Was there any chance, you have to ask yourself, that the entire Russian public would suddenly abandon its love of fiction and look only at factual documentary films? Did this seem at all likely? If you read Vertov, he says, why shouldn't they? It's wonderful. It's life caught unawares. That's the other great phrase he uses, life caught unawares. Why would they not be fascinated by everything that's happening around them? Well, yes. But this is a population that had been avid cinema goers for a very long time, for at least the last 15, 20 years. Were they suddenly going to abandon the habits of a lifetime? Didn't they want to go out and watch, a fictional film, a film that would make them laugh, cry, etc.? Many people who were trying to invent a new style Soviet cinema believed that, yes, a major reformation was needed, but no, it was not going to go down the path of being totally non-fictional. And that was the problem. That's the problem that Eisenstein, Kuleshov, and others set themselves, how to create this new kind of cinema. Vertov would have none of that. He was resolutely opposed to anything that smacked of fiction. And it's entertaining, extremely entertaining to read his polemics when he rubbishes everything that everybody else is doing. But you imagine there must have been a fair bit of teeth grinding. If you try to imagine what it was like amongst the filmmakers down at the studio, the Pudovkins, the Eisensteins, the Kuleshovs, what were they saying about Vertov? Probably not very polite things. He had a position. The position was an interesting one. It had some support. It even had support at bureaucratic levels, some support. But in the end, what the mission of the new generation of Soviet filmmakers was to create this new popular Soviet cinema. And there were various ideas about how to do that. Eisenstein, of course, cracked it with the Battleship Potemkin. Well, actually, he did it with his first film, The Strike, which was extremely popular, very successful, but got a very limited release. It was a collective film. It was not a Hollywood-style film in any way. But for Vertov, it was fatally flawed by being fictionalized. Why shouldn't it be, as it were, life caught unawares? Eisenstein's next film, The Battleship Potemkin, which became a runaway success, especially abroad, created a new brand image for the new Soviet cinema. This left Vertov with a problem, because I think we have to accept that both Vertov and Eisenstein were rather competitive figures. I mean, they were young men who had, in a way, everything to gain, quite a lot to lose, because they had a standing, a position, a reputation, and they were both very conscious of their reputation. I think that's pretty clear. Vertov must in turn have felt frustrated by Eisenstein pulling ahead. And when Battleship Potemkin swept the world in Europe and even further afield from 1926 onwards, I'm pretty sure that Vertov really took it to heart. I mean, we do have diaries. We do know that he was keenly aware of what was happening in other countries. We know that he thought the German filmmakers in particular were stealing some of his best ideas. And when it came to his idea of a day in the life of the city, He was furious that Walter Ruttmann had made his film Berlin before he, Vertov, had managed to make his version of it, a truly Soviet version, which became, of course, what we know as the man with the movie camera. So he was competitive. And he was making what feature-length films that he could along the way. He made two films after Kino Glas. He made Stride Soviet and 1/6 of the World. Then he made The 11th Year. So in all, three films: a chronicle film, The 11th Year, an advertising film, 1/6 of the World, and Stride Soviet, which is a kind of, hortatory exhortation film. Come on, look at the progress we're making, jollying people along. Because Vertov's value, if you like, to the regime was that he was making films that were in keeping with the spirit of trying to encourage people to change their ways, hurl themselves into extra work, change the old customs that were holding Russia back. In a sense, he's almost like an early adopter of the 5-year plan approach, which would come along when Stalin finally took control in 1929. Vertov can be seen as a kind of early adopter. The tone of his films, even before that, is very much in the spirit of the 5-year plan. But what he wanted to do with The Man with the Movie Camera is a bit different. With that, he wanted to make a manifesto film, just as Kino Glas had been. But here, the aim is very different. In a sense, he's trying to show, and this is very clear from the titles that lead into the film, it's an experiment in constructing a film that is dramatic, but not dramatic by storytelling, by conventional narrative means. So it's like a day in the life of a cameraman, who is Mikhail Kaufman, his brother, who is shown filming, although we often, or very rarely, see what he's filming, but we see the circumstances of his filming. So what Vertov has done is to shift, as it were, one level up to show the process of constructing a non-fictional film, to show the intrinsic drama of urban life. Trains, trams rushing by, cars rushing by, etc. That becomes the drama of the film. And the idea is to construct this in such a way that we have a kind of non-fiction narrative. Now that's very much in keeping with one of the big currents in early Soviet culture, the idea of factography, that you can make all sorts of things. You can make paintings, you can make plays, you can make novels out of factual material. It's a real kind of strand within constructivist art and experimentation. And Vertov is absolutely in tune with that. The Man with the Movie Camera is a factographic drama. Everything in it is set up, but it's set up to be shown as the components that make up the creation of a film that is about the making of a film. And of course, that is what has made it such an extraordinarily fascinating film for us. On the other side of modernism, on the other side of postmodernism, the film continues to have this fascination. It's been much misrepresented. It used to be described as, a day in the life of Moscow, which it definitely isn't. It's a composite of at least 3 cities. And Yuri Tsivian, in his work on the textual elaboration of the film, has shown that there's a lot of polemic actually buried within the film. Not everything is just as you see it on the screen. When you see, for instance, the image of the Bolshoi theatre seeming to sort of split, and then it kind of goes and appears to collapse, that's actually a reference, Yuri argues, to a debate that was going on at the time, that it was time to pull down the Bolshoi theatre because it was a relic of the old imperial period. And it's Vertov's way of alluding to something which is in the air. And lots of the other things, there's a scene of a woman waking up, there's a shot of a film poster, there are references to the kind of fictional surround of people's lives. And for Vertov, this is very much a commentary on how modern urban Soviets are still enthralled to the world that he despises, which is the world of vulgar fiction. Why do we need any of that when I can make a film like Man with a Movie Camera? And, the film's popularity, now that it's been kind of rediscovered and equipped with a wonderful new score, with many new scores, in a way is a tribute to Vertov's foresight. I mean, nobody at the time, and I would want to stress this, very few people thought in 1929 that Vertov had pulled off something absolutely groundbreaking. In fact, there's quite a considerable amount of hostility to the film. And certainly in Britain, it was regarded as being not the way forward. And John Grierson, the patron of British documentary, was very hostile to it, extremely hostile to it. Eisenstein was extremely hostile to it and said it's mere camera trickery. So there's a kind of chorus of opposition to what Vertov was doing, which of course must have hurt him deeply, but at the same time must have also consolidated his feeling that he was on the right track. Because I think there's a certain air of victimhood that hangs over Vertov by the end of the decade. In a sense, if he's not drawing fire, then he's not doing his job. And that's really quite difficult when you start to think about Vertov, you know, the man, the human being, the person who was feeling pushed out by this time. Because there's no question that by the time he made Man with the Movie Camera, he was largely excluded from the pantheon of Soviet cinema, and he was also finding it more and more difficult to raise money, to get backing, to make his projects. So Man with the Movie Camera is almost like a last, almost desperate attempt. There's nothing desperate about it. It's a wonderful film, but it's like a throwing down the gauntlet and saying, look what I can do, even from the margins, even from working in Ukraine, which is where the film was essentially made. I can still do something that knocks the socks off what you guys are doing in Moscow and Leningrad. And in a sense, it's a bit late, but Vertov's belief in the powers of non-fiction film, of course, was vindicated, because that film fascinates us much, much more today than almost any other film from the early Soviet period. Possibly only Battleship Potemkin really holds its place alongside Man with the Movie Camera. The Soviet cinema made its reputation really, certainly abroad, at the very end of the silent period, the pre-synchronized sound period. And Caroline Lejeune, very well-known early British critic, has a wonderful chapter in her book, The Cinema, where she says, what an irony that the one thing that might have saved silent cinema, namely Soviet cinema, came just a bit too late. Because she was writing the book when the talkie revolution had already happened in 1929. And it had happened, and it became clear to everyone that there was no going back. People dithered for a time, thinking, you know, no, silent cinema will continue. But very quickly it became clear that this was not going to happen. And this was traumatic for especially Soviet filmmakers, because so much of the theory of montage cinema had been built up around the ability to permutate increasingly short fragments of film in a completely free way to create an intensive visual texture, tapestry, rhythm, unhampered by having to think about the sound. So that if you look at a late silent film like Eisenstein's October, or particularly the Old and the New, which he wanted to synchronize with soundtrack, but never managed to, what you see is two films that it's extremely difficult to accompany them, because there's so much happening visually that any attempt to actually match the visual in detail with sound would have been doomed to failure. So Eisenstein, Pudovkin and Alexandrov publish a manifesto quite early on saying, you know, we're not afraid of sound, but actually we are, quite, because we're afraid that sound will be used to destroy the whole structure of montage, the culture of montage, as they call it. And that was published in English translation in the journal Close Up. So there was a kind of sense of nervousness. What was going to happen to the miracle that was Soviet cinema now that the talkies had arrived? Vertov saw his opportunity. Vertov had never believed that film was intrinsically silent. In fact, one of his very last Kino Pravdas is called the Radio Pravda. He was very interested in radio. And he saw that as a pointer towards a kind of audiovisual future. It's another of those ways in which Vertov really was a visionary figure. He rushed into the breach and said, I'm not afraid of sound. In fact, I want to use the sound systems we've got to demonstrate how sound can really add something tremendous to the kind of films I want to make. And so he gets a commission to make a film about the Donbass, the great industrial arena that's being developed down in the south of Russia and the Ukraine. And he makes his film Enthusiasm, which is a combination of his 5-year plan enthusiasm, his enthusiasm for all things that are advancing the industrial might of the Soviet Union, with a kind of demonstration of what sound can do if sound is used imaginatively. And the opening of Enthusiasm is absolutely magical, because we hear radio waves, as it were. We are aware of radio as a new factor, which has, of course, been going for some time. And we also hear sounds that have been recorded but aren't necessarily being played in sync with what we're seeing. He's doing exactly what Eisenstein and his comrades said should be done, which is to have contrapunctal sound. But Vertov's just doing it. And that must have really been galling for most of the other Soviet filmmakers, because none of the other Soviet filmmakers, none of the big filmmakers, actually got their hands on making a sound film for several years. Pudovkin was the first one who pulled it off with a simple case, but he had to wait until 1933 for that. So Vertov stole a march on the others, and that did a great deal for his reputation. It's interesting that when he travels to the West finally, he's able to travel with a sound film. He manages to present Man with a Movie Camera, but above all, he manages to come to London, to the Film Society, which is one of the most, prestigious outposts of film culture in the Western world, and he shows Enthusiasm. There are some entertaining accounts of this event. Vertov traveled very little in the West. He didn't have much experience. I don't think he had any languages, but he was present at the screening, and Thorold Dickinson left this account of how when it came to actually showing the film, Vertov insisted on the sound being turned up to maximum. Now, the sound must have been horrible. We're talking about very early sound recording and very early sound amplification. And to turn the sound up to maximum must have been just excruciating. But for Vertov, what really mattered was the noise. He wanted people to feel the sound. So the leading members of the Film Society try to drag him away from the console. He hangs on bitterly. And they eventually drag him away and turn the sound down. It's amusing, slightly pathetic. It's how Vertov passed into legend as the man who couldn't get enough, the man who wanted to blast everybody out of their seats. It made him, in some senses, a figure of fun. And if you look at the history of how Soviet cinema began to be written up in the West, Thorold Dickinson published a book in the late 40s about Soviet cinema, and he tells this story. And Vertov doesn't come out of it well. He takes a rather sort of Griersonian line about Vertov, that while Vertov is kind of great fun and very lively and all the rest of it, he's not really about serious filmmaking. And in a way, Vertov's reputation went into sort of deep freeze from that point onwards. It was impossible to see Enthusiasm, to see what all the fuss had been about. When I was working at the British Film Institute, I made a point of bringing Enthusiasm into distribution because I'd never seen it. And I felt that we were living in a strange state of knowing Man with a Movie Camera extraordinarily well. People knew it off by heart, but we didn't know what had been the actual film that was Vertov's last major testament. And we did bring it into distribution, but it's never, of course, become as well known. Whereas the advent of video, and particularly of the new restorations of DVD and Blu-ray, has actually made Enthusiasm come up looking and sounding like a new film. It's an extraordinary film. It's got a whole new lease of life, a first lease of life, which it never had before. But Vertov's reputation languished, and it's interesting that the last long film that he's managed to make, which was Three Songs of Lenin, which is a very troubled film, a film made during the ascendancy of socialist realism, a film made at a time when the kind of thing he was trying to do was deeply out of fashion, and Stalin was openly backing the filmmakers who were trying to create a new popular cinema of exhortation. This mournful lament for the ghost of Lenin, a rather feminist film, as Vertov keen to point out, did not get wide distribution. It was sent back for recutting. Emphases in it had to be changed. There are at least 3 versions of the film, or there were 3 versions of the film at different times, and so it never got wide distribution in the West. I mean, there was a print of it in one of the Soviet-oriented distributors' libraries, but nobody ever watched it because everybody believed that Vertov had, in a sense, been defeated at the end of the 1920s, and that was the end of him. And the long period of silence that followed before his death was seen as part of Stalin's triumph in rolling back the experimental wing of Soviet cinema. But then what happened, of course, was that from the late 1960s onwards and in the 1970s, and gathering momentum in the 80s, Vertov staged a major comeback. And I would say that by the time we reached, let's say, the end of the Soviet Union, the beginning of the 90s, Vertov's reputation had risen so high that, in a sense, it was much higher than, say, Eisenstein's. They'd reversed positions. Vertov had become the poster boy for what Soviet cinema could have been, should have been, and briefly was. Whereas Eisenstein, having continued and made films like Alexander Nevsky, and particularly Ivan the Terrible, was seen by many as Eisenstein having succumbed to Stalinist pressures to make a kind of overdone dramatic film where the propaganda values exceed the formal values that had once been at the heart of his cinema. Now, I think that's deeply wrong and not true about Eisenstein, but the fact of the matter is that Vertov's reputation stood extraordinarily high. And if you look at the amazing amount of writing and teaching, this is the beginning of film studies around this time, going on around Vertov, it is astonishing. I mean, Vertov would be, as it were, rotating rapidly in his grave with pride, living up to his name, if he could have known, because I think he must have died a rather sad and unhappy figure, a man who still believed he was right, but felt he'd been pushed aside by the onrush of Stalinist cinema. I think the last decades of his life were very sad for Vertov, and the sense that he was marginalized, not allowed to work really, I think weighed very heavily on him. And we do have a selection of his diaries from that period. And there's one entry which I find very poignant. It's an entry about Mayakovsky, the poet, who had been one of the most enthusiastic supporters of the revolution, had become, in many ways, the poster boy for poetry under the early Soviet regime, but again had suffered tremendous disappointments. And interestingly, Mayakovsky had always wanted to get into film. He saw a natural kind of bridge from the kind of poetry he was writing into making films. And he was a supporter of Vertov's. I mean, he believed that film could be non-fictional. He wrote several scenarios which were never filmed because that wasn't what was wanted at the time. So Vertov had enormous respect for Mayakovsky, and he hero worshipped him, basically. He said, that he regarded him as being one of the great inspirations of his maturity. And he must have understood that Mayakovsky had that kind of frustration. Then Mayakovsky committed suicide, and Stalin delivered the epitaph that it was a crime not to respect the memory of Mayakovsky. And at that point, Mayakovsky's reputation entered a very curious limbo because he was force-fed onto the Soviet public. School kids had to learn Mayakovsky by the ream, and in many ways it didn't do Mayakovsky's reputation any good. Maybe there are some parallels between Mayakovsky and Vertov being force-fed to generations of students without necessarily understanding where it's coming from and what very real frustrations and reverses they both suffered in their careers. But what Vertov writes in his diaries is about the last time he saw Mayakovsky, and he conveys something of his fellow feeling, his warmth, his admiration for Mayakovsky. And Mayakovsky says, "We've got to talk. I really want to get together with you and talk about things." And that's the last time he ever saw him, because not long afterwards, Mayakovsky committed suicide. So for Vertov, this is an unbearably poignant memory. He had a sense that Mayakovsky still valued him, that they were kindred folk, and yet their dialogue was cut short. And of course, Vertov didn't commit suicide, but he lived on into an unhappy period of inactivity. Minor newsreel work came his way, but nothing on the scale of what he had achieved in the 20s and early 30s. And so his reputation, such as it is, which is considerable today, is entirely posthumous and very much a product, I think, of that revolution in taste, which swept away much of the received wisdom about Soviet cinema. It was very tough on Soviet filmmakers of the 20s and early 30s who find themselves pushed aside by a new estimation which said that Vertov was the truly revolutionary, the truly radical, the truly experimental filmmaker, and all the rest were merely making their peace in varying degrees with the Stalinist demand. So it's complicated, and I think if you ask what is the situation we've reached today, I think the kind of scholarship that's now being done on early Soviet cinema, which Yuri Tsivian has been a leading figure in, is showing us that things were much more complicated than we once thought they were. I think there's a much greater understanding of the crucible of competing ambitions, competing positions, competing theories that Vertov came out of. There's not perhaps enough work yet on the question of what did people make of his films when they got a chance to see them. I did an anthology with Richard Taylor some years ago called The Film Factory, and we were looking for evidence of what people made of these films at the time, not just what their makers wrote about them, but what did actually people make of them. And there is one item in that which reports on the fact that people in a far-off collective farm somewhere in the sticks have heard about this man Vertov, but they can't see any of his films because they're not getting distributed. And of course, one of the untold stories of the Soviet 20s is what limited circulation many films had. Vertov himself complains that one of his films is in the cinemas in Moscow in 1929. It's playing well. He actually quotes the takings, how many rubles it's taking per week. And what do? They take it off to play a Harold Lloyd film. He's beside himself with rage, the indignity of it. But it just gives you an insight into the very real kind of conditions that the first generation of Soviet filmmakers faced. I mean, they're not surprising in a way because they're exactly what happens to the independent filmmakers of today. Vertov, like Eisenstein, like Kuleshov, like Ermler, like all of the others, they were, in a sense, independent filmmakers. They may have had considerable state backing at certain points, but when it came to the exhibition market, the people running the cinemas were still very prone to pulling the film off and putting in a Douglas Fairbanks or a Harold Lloyd. And that was deeply, deeply galling, particularly for Vertov, because he had the strong feeling that if only his films got the circulation, if only they got the exposure, if there were enough prints of them, the public would respond. And in a sense, that belief that he had was never really tested. If it had been, who knows, there might have been a stronger current of support. Now we have a very different situation thanks to DVD circulation. We can show these films actually in all kinds of situations, and we can really experience them as Vertov wanted them to be experienced, on a big screen in front of an audience. That didn't exist for a very long time. It's a new possibility to recapture and to retest Vertov's belief in what he was doing. And the interesting thing is that the films hold up remarkably well. They're genuinely exciting. They can hold an audience, and of course they return us to the heroic age of Soviet construction. Again, one can only lament the irony that Vertov's not around to appreciate it, but hey, we can still celebrate what he managed to achieve and be very grateful to those who preserved the films. This is extremely important. Many of the early Soviet films have disappeared or have existed in very fragmentary form, but the work of the archives, particularly the Austrian Film Archive, the Netherlands Film Archive, now the Eye, collectors of various kinds, they have preserved those films and kept them in usable form to the point where we can now see digital restoration being carried out on them. And that's just so lucky that those archivists have kept the faith, as it were, because otherwise we would just be reading about Vertov, and that wouldn't do at all.